Hello and welcome. You've found the Social Work Podcast. My name's Jonathan Singer, and I'll be your host as we explore all things social work.
Hi, this is Danielle Parrish. In today's Social Work Podcast, I'm talking with Jonathan Singer, the founder and host of the Social Work Podcast, about the podcast. Jonathan received his MSSW from UT Austin, his Ph.D. from the University of Pittsburgh, and he's now on faculty at Temple University in Philadelphia. He had actually invited me to do an interview at SWR on evidence-based practice, and in return, I was really interested in learning more about the Social Work Podcast and wanted to interview him as well. So today, we're going to talk a little bit about how the Social Work Podcast started, how he selects his topics and the people that he interviews, and how, after the interview, the podcast is actually produced. And then finally, how he connects with his listeners in a variety of ways. So I found it interesting. I'm sure you will too. So now on to episode 64, Behind the Scenes at the Social Work Podcast, an interview with Jonathan Singer. Hi, Jonathan. Thank you for joining us today and talking with us about the Social Work Podcast.
Well, you're welcome, Danielle. Are you trying to be me?
I am. I get to be you for a day.
That's right. I'm very glad to be here talking about the Social Work Podcast. Thank you for asking me to do this.
It's my pleasure. I'm excited to learn more about kind of how this developed and where things have gone since you started it in 2007.
Great.
So can you start by talking a little bit about what led to your decision to start the Social Work Podcast?
Yeah, so I was teaching a practice theory class at the University of Pittsburgh, and I wanted my students to have summaries of the lectures because I knew that they would be important when they took their licensure exam. And then I realized, well, if I put them on the content management system, it was Blackboard at the University of Pittsburgh, the students wouldn't have access to them once they graduated. So I decided that I would get a domain name, so I found socialworkpodcast.com. It was available, which is, I guess, not so much of a surprise in 2007. And then got some server space, and I started recording these summaries and posting them online. And I told my students that they were there. And that's what I did.
So it sounds like it really started out as a teaching modality to support your course, and kind of you've taken that and you've integrated your knowledge of technology, and it's become kind of just taken off as something that's not just reaching your students, but a wider audience of practitioners and researchers. Do you still use it in your courses?
I do use it in my courses, and I feel a little bad for my students because I think there's something I've heard from other instructors that there's something nice about assigning the podcast because it gives their students a different perspective. But my poor students have to listen to me in class, and then they have to listen to me outside of class. So, so I do use it, and actually I use the podcasts as a reminder for myself when I'm prepping for my classes. Like when I'm teaching behavior theory, I will listen to my podcast on behavior theory because it reminds me of some of the things that are important. Or, if I'm talking about working with diverse populations, I might listen to the interview that I did with Nancy Boyd Franklin about spirituality in African American families, or any number of topics. It's a good reminder for me as an instructor to bring up things in class.
So at what point did it move from being your own summaries to involving other professionals within social work, and I'm assuming maybe other disciplines as well?
I try and stick to social workers, but there have been interviews, a couple folks who are not social workers. Chris Wolf, a sex therapist, I interviewed her. Nancy Boyd Franklin, she's a psychologist, but is sort of an adopted social worker. I try and stick with social workers because I think it's important for social work students to be able to access these technology resources created by and for social workers. There are a lot of resources out there for counselors. There's the American Counseling Association podcast. It's got a lot of topics on clinical issues. American Psychological Association has information out there. So I wanted the social work perspective. Now, I did a bunch of summaries of lectures that I gave. And so those were the first episodes that went up, DSM for social workers, crisis intervention, the basics. And I already had those lectures written. So it was, in a sense, it was easy to record them. And then after a while, I kind of ran out. I didn't have much more to say. And so I started interviewing folks. And I interviewed Ed Seitz, who's a professor emeritus from University of Pittsburgh. He talked about grant writing. Here's a guy who has successfully received, I think, almost $500 million in grant funding through his career. He's never once in his career been without a grant. So who better to talk about writing a grant than Ed Seitz? And I was at the University of Pittsburgh. He was at the University of Pittsburgh. I knew he was retiring, and I thought, I want to archive this. I don't want to have to come up with a lecture on grant writing for my students when Ed could do it for me. But he can't guest lecture because he's retiring. So I'll record it. So part of the purpose is to have an archive of knowledge that is in the profession, and to have it so that I could access it, and so that, if you're one of two instructors in a small social work program somewhere in the United States, you can have guest lectures by Alan Rubin. You can have guest lectures by Kaya Bentley, by Larry Davis talking about race and social problems. So you can have these people come to your classroom without any cost to you, right? So that's part of why I did it.
What an excellent resource for social work educators. What have you gotten feedback about the use of the social work podcast among educators in social work? And
yeah, I have. A number of social work. I've gotten emails from instructors, and some instructors they'll email and they'll say, "Hey, is it okay if I link to the podcast?" And I just want everybody to know that it's got a Creative Commons license, which means as long as you don't modify it, as long as you don't make money off of it, and as long as you attribute the content to the social work podcast, then you can do whatever you want with it. You can take these, you can take the MP3 files and upload them to Blackboard. You can burn them onto a CD. You can put them on a hard drive. You can dub them on a cassette tape and send them to your grandmother. It's totally legitimate. Whatever you want to do with them, as long as you follow those 3 simple rules. And those are it's basic academia, right? That's what we do in academia with resources. We don't modify, we attribute, and we certainly don't make any money off of it. I lose money on this every year because I have to pay for server space and the domain name, and I don't get any money in. So, and it's a service. That's why I do it. So instructors say they like it. I get lots of emails from students. Some are looking for information. Do you have a podcast on such and such? I have to give a class presentation. Or I'm trying to do a paper on such and such. Do you have PowerPoints that you can send me? Whatever. And sometimes I'm able to say, hey, I don't have a podcast, but the University of Buffalo, they've got a podcast series called the Living Proof Podcast. They have an episode on this, so I can refer them to another podcast. I also get a lot of emails from social workers in the field who say that the podcast has been really useful in helping them to pass their licensure exam. And I think it's more placebo than anything else because there's nothing. I haven't looked at the licensure exam list, and I don't create podcasts to prep for that. There are sites you can go to. There are lots of paying sites you can do, and they have excellent resources. But But yeah, so social workers in the field say it helped me pass the licensure exam, or, I work with this population. It was so nice to do this, or I just got back into the field. Thank you so much. I've been listening to this. And practitioners and instructors from around the world have sent emails and said that they like the podcast. So for me, it's amazing, because this is something that I started for my students at the University of Pittsburgh in 2007. And it's obviously met a need.
Yeah, it sounds like you have a very wide audience. How do you pick your topics? How do you decide what to do next?
That's a great question, and there are a couple different ways. So folks send me suggestions all the time. In the last 6 months, I've gotten 17 requests for different topics. And so sometimes I will get a request, and I will search out somebody with expertise. Sometimes I know somebody with expertise that I know will be a good interview, and I will seek them out. And sometimes I'll be engaged in a conversation with somebody, and they'll say, I really love the podcast. I really wish there were more episodes on community organizing, because I don't really have very many on community organizing at this point. And I'll say, oh, well, you're a community organizer. Like, yes, I am. Well, let's do something with that. So let's meet that need. So those are three ways that I come up with my topics. And there's no real rhyme or reason for the order of what I publish when. It's whenever I get them out.
So how do you specifically engage your audience most? Is it through Facebook? Is it through your actual website? I understand that some folks are able to automatically download the podcast. So can you talk a little bit about that, and for folks that are trying to stay continuously connected to the podcast?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are a lot of different ways that I connect with listeners. One of the ways is sometimes people post comments on the Social Work Podcast website. More often, they go to Facebook, because there's a Facebook fan page for the Social Work Podcast. And right now, there are almost 1,500 fans of the Social Work Podcast from all over. And if you're a fan of the Social Work Podcast, then whenever there's a new episode, it automatically says, hey, there's a new episode, and people like it. They click the like button, or they'll leave a comment. I also have a Twitter feed for the Social Work Podcast. And so sometimes I'll take quotes from episodes, and I'll just post them up there. Or I will say, I'm interviewing Danielle Parrish on evidence-based practice. Is there anything you would like me to ask her? And I do that on Facebook, and then people can respond. And so increasingly, I'm actually trying to integrate listeners' questions in my interviews, because I think that's a really interesting way of figuring out, well, what do people want to hear?
Absolutely. So you're getting feedback, and you're using multiple, or through these social networking sites, and sounds like you're using a lot of different ways to kind of engage your audience through social networking.
Yeah, and I also have there's a Google Voice phone number. And so on the Social Work Podcast webpage, if you, on the right side, there's something that says call me. And you can call a number, and it goes automatically to voicemail, and you can leave me a message saying, hey, my name's Doug, I'm from Iowa, and I'm really interested in how you work with truancy in youth. Could you do a podcast on that, or whatever? And so you can actually leave a voicemail if you don't want to leave a message or email or whatever. People can also email me at cooljazz@flash.net, and, I respond to those. So there are lots of ways to connect.
Great. I would imagine that you've had an opportunity to meet a lot of different people through the course of interviewing for the podcast, and I'm wondering what have been some of the most memorable experiences for you in this process, and just in general what the process is like, meeting with so many different people across the social work profession.
Well, it's been great. I mean, people say that they learn from the podcast, and I certainly learn from the interviews that I do. Sometimes I ask questions because I think they're good prompts, but oftentimes I ask questions because I don't really know the answers, and so I learn. I think that in terms of actual interviews, they run the gamut. Some of the interviews have been just kind of awe-inspiring, and some of the interviews have been challenges to figure out what's the right question, or I'll ask a question and I realize after I've asked it, it's not getting at what I want to get out of the question. And as a clinician, I know what that's like. But when you're having a session with a family, or you're doing group, or you're doing individual, like, you can do it again. But you don't want to ask the same question over and over and over again in a podcast. So that's been challenging. But I think in terms of memorable interviews, I think that, like when I was interviewing Barbara Jones on pediatric oncology social work, I teared up. I was so moved by the stories she was telling about the kids that she worked with. I totally wasn't expecting that. And I think you can hear that in the podcast. I mean, you can't hear me crying, but you can hear the sort of the connection, and it's really powerful. Another episode that was memorable, but for a different reason, I was interviewing Jim Driscoll about reactive attachment disorder, and we were in a hotel room, and there were somebody vacuuming outside the door, and when they would stop, construction workers outside the window would start, and they would stop, and then the vacuums would start, and then the construction workers, and it was a stop-start interview, really very challenging. But really, the guests have been so wonderful, and really giving of their time and expertise. It's just been, I don't know, for me it's been great, and I think that people have really appreciated it, and so it's like a win-win. That's the great thing. This is a win-win endeavor.
So once you've finished the interview for the podcast, how do you put everything together and make the final product?
The final product, it starts even before the interview, because I'm always thinking about how can I make sure that this is no more than 45 minutes. If you listen to professional, like NPR or like, I don't know, Terry Gross or something like that, like, interviews don't last an hour. Really, nobody can sit through that. I mean, unless you're like Bill Moyers, and you're interviewing Joseph Campbell. Like, you can't do that. And so I always come up with a list of questions in advance with my guests. I make sure that they're comfortable with the questions, that the questions are going to get after what we want. It's not like 60 minutes. I'm not trying to catch somebody in a lie. I'm just trying to get some useful information. So then we do the interview. And I always let people know that if they answer a question and they want to do over, we can totally do over. It's all on tape. We can edit it out. That's fine. So once I have that, then I'll edit it. I use Sony SoundForge to do the audio editing. I've got the intro and the outro music. That's already pre-recorded. I write an introduction where I talk about the guest. I give a summary of what the listeners will hear. And then they hear what they hear, and then it's an outro. So I put all those together. I save it as an MP3 file, and I use the same settings as NPR does for their podcast, because I figure if NPR does it, it's good enough for me. And then I upload it to the server, and I create something for the Social Work Podcast website. I update the RSS feed, and I ping iTunes, and then it's off and running.
Wow. It sounds like quite a process, but one that you've really been able to fine-tune. And obviously I've noticed that the sound quality is really good when I listen to the website, which is amazing now that I'm realizing that you do these interviews in hotel rooms and when there could be vacuuming outside and, a variety of noises in the background. So,
yeah, no, and that's where the editing comes in. I really try hard to minimize those distractors. But sometimes they happen, and if they do, I try and give a disclaimer up front. Like there was a series of interviews I did at Society for Social Work and Research in 2010, and there were pigeons on the balcony outside the room, and you could hear them in the background. And so in the beginning of those episodes, I said, and by the way, if you hear pigeons in the background, it's the recording. It's not you. So
I guess you never know what you're going to hear.
That's
in
right.
any given place. So how do you get a sense of what your audience is, what is most popular with your audience, what they're liking that's being posted, and how many of a particular podcast is being downloaded? How do you measure that?
That's a great question, and there's this term web metrics, which is sort of measuring what happens on the internet. There's no standard these days for figuring out what are the best web metrics. Like in academia, you can look at citation counts for articles. How many times has your article been cited? Or you can look at an impact factor for a journal, and there's a formula for that. I use Google Analytics, which is a free program, and I also use Webalizer, which is on the server. And those are two programs that give me data on who's listening, on what podcasts are being downloaded, and how many visitors and where they're from and all that sort of stuff. To the best that I can tell, each episode is being downloaded. When it's first posted, it's downloaded between 3,500 and 7,500 times. And then it goes down each month. And I think that's because there are a lot of people who subscribe on iTunes. And so when there's a new episode, iTunes automatically downloads it to your computer. And in fact, that's the definition of a podcast. A podcast is the combination of an audio file or a video file and the technology called Real Simple Syndication, or RSS, that allows people to subscribe. And when you subscribe, that means it comes to you. You don't have to look for it. And that's what distinguishes podcasts from the technology that was around in the late 90s in the internet, where you could listen to audio on the web. And all that started around 2004. And so I know the interview on cognitive behavioral therapy has been downloaded 30,000 plus times. Wow. I don't know if people have listened to it 30,000 plus times. I don't know if it was 30,000 individual unique downloads. It could be that somebody downloaded it and then their computer crashed. They downloaded it again. It's the same thing with visitors. I know that there have been about 100,000 unique visitors come to the site. So each visitor counts one time. I count only once in that number. But I know that there have been over 300,000 page hits or page views. And so I get that information. I also know that there have been visitors from 178 countries. And I know that most of them are from the United States, but there are a lot from other English-speaking countries. But there are also listeners in Iran and India and a bunch of countries in Africa. And I find that really interesting, too. I wonder who those people are. Mm-hmm. But that's not the kind of information I can get off of the internet. And so that's why when people contact me, I ask them, how did you find the podcast? What episodes do you listen to? And so then I just get, basic, what's that called? Anecdotal. Yeah, I get anecdotal. I get anecdotal feedback. So, yeah.
So it does sound like a very hard thing to measure. I'm intrigued by the fact that you're getting folks that are viewing the podcast from all around the world. Do you get requests for different types of topics from other countries, and what do those kind of look like? Yeah,
I got a request from somebody in Iran on group work with people with addictions in Iran, and I had no idea how to do that podcast. I've been in touch with some folks in Australia. There are some concepts in social work that they teach there that we don't teach in the United States. And they've asked for me to do episodes on those concepts, and I've had to look them up. So I've had discussions with folks, and off the top of my head, I can't remember the names of them, like the concepts. But that's interesting. And I've really actually wanted to do an episode where I have social workers from different countries talking about what social work is like in that country or what the role of social workers is. I think that would be a really interesting sort of international podcast.
Yeah, that sounds like it'd be fascinating. Well, thank you so much for your time today. It's been very interesting for me to learn more about kind of the background and history and ongoing process with the Social Work Podcast, and I look forward to being an ongoing subscriber.
Well, thank you, Danielle. Thanks for interviewing me. It's fun to talk about it. Thanks for giving me the opportunity. I'm glad you suggested it. I'm Jonathan Singer, and thanks for being with me today for another episode of the Social Work Podcast. If you missed an episode or have suggestions for future episodes, please visit socialworkpodcast.com. If you'd like to support the podcast, please visit our online store at cafepress.com/swpodcast. To all the social workers out there, keep up the good work. We'll see you next time at the Social Work Podcast.